Welcome back to Educator.com. This is the lesson on wildlife and endangered species. All right, a little bit about sustainable yields and viable populations. So the MSY, or maximum sustainable yield, is the maximum growth rate that the population could sustain indefinitely. Meaning, as time goes on, they can stay at that level. So that's kind of at one extreme in terms of population estimates for the future for a species. And then on the other end, there's minimum viable population, the smallest population that can maintain itself and genetic variability indefinitely. So the minimum viable population is probably not going to be 2. If we were talking about bison or buffalo, having 2 individuals is probably not the minimum. You might think, well, but isn't it the minimum because those 2 can have babies and then from that point on it's good as long as we protect them? Well, keep in mind they're saying that it can maintain itself and genetic variability indefinitely. When you have just 2 left and their responsibilities to regenerate a more abundant population of that species, that's a lot of pressure in terms of genetic variability because in a sense it's inbreeding when there's just 2 left. So you're not going to get that genetic variability that's desirable in the long term for a population. They'll be extremely vulnerable to environmental change, more so than if you had a lot more than 2. So the maximum sustainable yield and minimum viable population is going to vary depending on the organism we're talking about. In between those 2 is the optimum sustainable population. So it's between the 2. It's that, in a sense, happy medium. It's not reasonable, especially if a species is threatened or endangered, to get up to the maximum sustainable yield. That may not be feasible because the area that it used to exist in, a lot of it is now human civilization, or a lot of that forest has been destroyed. But on the one hand, we don't want to get down to the minimum. So having some kind of optimum in the middle is what a lot of scientists or environmentalists are shooting for. Here's some examples with the grizzly bear and the American bison. The grizzly bear is fascinating to me. I live in California. It's on the state flag, but there are no grizzly bears in California anymore. There used to be a lot of them in the United States. Not so much anymore. You have to go up into Canada for a good chance of seeing a grizzly bear. So they are definitely endangered. And some little facts about the grizzly bear. When you're looking at the females, you're seeing adults up to about 300 pounds, and then with males up to about 600 pounds. A full-grown one standing up on its hind legs, 8 feet tall. That's pretty intimidating. So yeah, part of the reason they are endangered is, well, they were considered a threat, and a lot of them were hunted for and killed, more so than probably should have, and that's why we don't see them as much in the United States. So, how can we estimate where the grizzly population was? If we go back to the 1800s, we don't have a time machine, obviously, but in terms of records that were kept, we don't have exact numbers, and they wouldn't have been able to give us exact numbers back then, but we can look at Lewis and Clark's expedition. So in the 19th century, in the early 1800s, when they made that expedition to the West Coast, they kept track of how many grizzly bears they saw, and they were actually very specific. When they passed buffalo or bison, they would just say like, oh, there's a lot of them over there, because they weren't as much of a threat. They didn't care to figure out, hey, are there 1,000 bison, or are there 5,000? They just would say there's a lot of them. But with grizzly bears, being surprised by seeing one and the potential threat, they made note in their journal, we saw a grizzly bear today. We saw 3 of them today. And when you add up the total number, in their journey, they encountered 37 over 1,000 miles that they traveled. They kept miles in their journal rather than kilometers. And so that comes down to about 3.7 grizzly bears per 100 square miles of area. And if you consider the space where grizzly bears existed back then, they've come up with a calculation that in the early 1800s, there were about 12,000 grizzly bears. There are significantly less now, but they are protected, and hopefully because of human intervention and regulation, in terms of preserving them, we can get back to a reasonable number. 12,000 grizzly bears may not be reasonable at this point in time. When we look at the American bison, slightly different tale. we've been able to bring back the American bison to fairly high levels in terms of their overall population numbers. We're certainly not at the maximum sustainable yield. We're not going to go there again because in the mid-1800s, we're talking millions of bison roaming the plains. A lot of Native American tribes depended on them directly. And during especially the middle of the 1800s into the 1870s, a lot of bison were hunted by white Americans, and actually a lot of areas were burned to get the Native Americans to move and to get the bison to move, and a lot of bison were killed in that process as well, and skinned for hides, etc. Now the American bison is estimated to be 200,000 to 300,000 in total, and there are bison in every state, including Hawaii. And interestingly enough, Hawaii is different from their native habitat of the grassland or plains region of the United States, the contiguous United States. And even on Catalina Island off the coast of California, you can find bison. But anyways, that's a fairly reasonable number in terms of getting them back to a sustainable population. This might be what we could consider the optimum sustainable population. There's a lot of them. There's actually a business of selling them to market for meat. Buffalo or bison meat is desirable to some people, and the furs certainly are a good thing as well. So yeah, those are two examples of how you can save a population from extinction.